Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Her True Stories. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we dive into this absolutely wild story of revenge, consequences, and family drama, let me ask you something. Have you ever been disrespected by someone you loved, only to have the people closest to you take their side? Have you ever been told you're overreacting when someone crosses a line that should never be crossed? Well, buckle up because today's story is about a 59-year-old woman who discovered exactly what happens when you mistake someone's kindness for weakness. This is story number 119, and trust me when I say you've never heard anything quite like this. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell because I post these incredible true stories every single day, and you don't want to miss a single one. And if you're part of our amazing community already, drop a heart emoji in the comments so I know you're here with me. Today we're talking about Vivian Drake, a stunning, successful businesswoman who built an empire from nothing, only to watch her own son choose his new wife's ego over his mother's dignity. But here's the thing about successful women. We don't just get mad, we get strategic. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into this story that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why you should never, and I mean never, underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. Let's get started. My name is Vivian Drake, and at 59 years old, I've learned that elegance is not just about how you carry yourself when times are good. It's about maintaining your poise when the world shows you its true face. Tonight, at my son's wedding reception, I would discover just how cruel that face could be. The Drake estate had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had been polished to mirror perfection. White orchids and peonies, $100,000 worth, cascaded from every surface, their fragrance mingling with the scent of Dom Perignon that flowed as freely as water. I had spared no expense for Preston's wedding to Eleanor Calloway, the stunning 29-year-old who had captured my son's heart and, I suspected, his common sense. I stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, watching 300 of society's most influential figures celebrate under the soft glow of candlelight. My midnight blue Valentino gown, chosen specifically to complement rather than compete with the bride, whispered against the floor as I moved through the crowd. At 59, I'd been told countless times that I was still striking. Silver blonde hair that caught light like spun platinum, sapphire eyes that had seen decades of boardroom battles, and a smile that could charm investors or freeze them out, depending on my mood. Tonight, my smile was genuine. This was my son's day, and despite my reservations about Eleanor, Elle, as she insisted everyone call her, I was determined to be the gracious mother-in-law. After all, I had built an empire from nothing after my husband's death when Preston was just 7. I had raised him alone, funded his Ivy League education, and brought him into my luxury hotel and vineyard business. If he had chosen this woman, surely there was something I had missed, some depth beneath her obvious beauty and social climbing tendencies. Elle was undeniably stunning in her $40,000 custom Vera Harper gown, a creation that had taken 6 months to design and construct. The dress was a masterpiece of silk and French lace, with hand-sewn pearls that caught the light with every movement. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate updo that showcased the 2-carat diamond earrings, my wedding gift to her, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like a princess from a fairy tale, and perhaps that should have been my first warning. Fairy tale princesses, I'd learned in business, rarely made good partners in the real world. Preston, my handsome 32-year-old son, looked every inch the groom in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile radiant as he moved through the crowd accepting congratulations. He had my late husband's strong jaw and my blue eyes, though his held a softness that sometimes worried me. In business, Softness could be mistaken for weakness, and I'd spent years trying to teach him the steel beneath silk approach that had served me so well. As the evening progressed, I noticed the subtle dynamics at play. Elle's friends, a collection of social media influencers and trust fund babies, clustered around her like courtiers around a queen. They giggled at her every word, complimented her dress in voices that carried just far enough for others to hear the price tag woven into their praise. Elle basked in their attention, her laughter bright and sharp as champagne bubbles. I found myself observing rather than participating, a habit developed over years of business negotiations. Body language often told more truth than words, and what I saw troubled me. The way Elle's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at the older generation of wedding guests. The dismissive glance she gave the waitstaff. The subtle way she positioned herself to be photographed from her best angles, treating her own wedding reception like a professional photo shoot. But it was Preston's behavior that concerned me most. My confident, educated son seemed to defer to Elle's every whim, jumping to fulfill requests before she even finished making them. When she frowned at the flower arrangements, the ones I'd spent weeks perfecting with the event planner, he immediately called the coordinator over to discuss adjustments. When she complained that the champagne wasn't the brand she preferred, despite it being a vintage Dom Perignon that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week, he sent someone to locate her preferred label. As the evening wore on, I decided it was time for the traditional mother of the groom toast. I'd spent days crafting my words, wanting to strike the perfect balance between welcoming Elle into our family and honoring the love Preston claimed to feel for her. I approached the small stage where the band had been playing, accepting the microphone from the lead singer with a gracious nod. The crowd began to quiet, sensing the moment approaching. I smoothed my gown and smiled out at the assembled guests, my eyes finding Preston and Elle at the head table. They sat like royalty, and perhaps that's exactly how they saw themselves: young, beautiful, and entitled to the world's adoration. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying easily across the ballroom thanks to years of speaking at corporate events and board meetings. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the union of two people, but the joining of two families, two histories, and hopefully, two bright futures." A server approached with a crystal glass of champagne on a silver tray, and I accepted it with a grateful smile. The champagne was perfect, golden and effervescent, catching the light like liquid sunshine. I raised the glass, feeling the weight of tradition and expectation in the gesture. "Preston has been the light of my life since the moment he was born," I continued, watching my son's face soften with emotion. "I've watched him grow from a curious little boy into the remarkable man who stands before us today. And Eleanor," I turned slightly to include her in my gaze, "I welcome you into our family with open arms and an open heart." It was then that disaster struck, though disaster seems too small a word for what would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. James Morrison, a family friend who had perhaps enjoyed one too many glasses of wine himself, was making his way toward the stage, presumably to offer his own congratulations. In his slightly inebriated state, he misjudged the distance between himself and my position at the edge of the small stage. His shoulder connected with my arm, just as I was raising my glass higher for the toast. The champagne arced through the air in what seemed like slow motion, catching the light from the chandeliers as it fell in a golden cascade. Time seemed suspended as I watched the liquid descend, knowing with horrible certainty exactly where it would land. The champagne struck Elle's dress like a small tsunami, soaking the intricate lacework of her bodice and spreading across the silk in a dark stain that was visible to every single person in that ballroom. The $40,000 masterpiece was ruined in an instant, transformed from bridal perfection to a sodden mess that clung to her frame. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people held their collective breath, waiting to see how this disaster would unfold. I felt my face flush with mortification, my heart pounding as I realized the magnitude of what had just happened. This was Elle's wedding day, her moment of absolute perfection, and it had been destroyed in a single, terrible second. Oh my God, I gasped, immediately setting down the microphone and rushing toward her. Elle, I'm so sorry. It was an accident. James bumped into me, and I never got to finish my explanation. Elle's face had transformed from bridal radiance to pure fury. Her dark eyes blazed with a rage so intense it seemed to heat the air around her. The mask of sweetness she'd worn all evening fell away completely, revealing something ugly and vicious underneath. "You stupid, clumsy bitch," she screamed, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom like a crack of thunder. "Look what you've done. This dress cost more than most people make in a year." I stopped in my tracks, stunned by the venom in her voice. Around us, I could hear the collective intake of breath from our guests, could feel the weight of their shocked stares. This was not how civilized people behaved, especially not at their own wedding. "Elle, please," I said softly, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of her outburst. "It was an accident. I'll pay for the cleaning, or for a replacement." "A replacement?" she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made several guests visibly wince. "There is no replacement. This was custom-made, you ignorant old cow. 6 months of fittings, and you've destroyed it in 5 seconds." Before I could respond, before I could even process what was happening, Elle's hands were on me. She shoved me backward with surprising force, her manicured nails digging into my shoulders through the delicate fabric of my gown. I stumbled, my heel catching in the hem of my dress, and for a terrifying moment I thought I might fall. But Elle wasn't finished. As I struggled to regain my balance, her hand connected with my cheek in a slap that echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The sting was immediate and sharp, but it was nothing compared to the pain of what came next. "Dirty old witch," she spat, her beautiful face twisted with hatred. "Clean it now. Get on your knees and clean up your mess, you pathetic has-been." The words hit me like physical blows. In 59 years of life, through boardroom battles and business wars, through the grief of losing my husband and the challenges of raising a son alone, no one had ever spoken to me with such venomous disrespect. The humiliation was complete and total, witnessed by every person who mattered in our social circle. I stood there, my hand rising automatically to touch my stinging cheek, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Around us, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 300 people stared at us like spectators at a car accident, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, disgust, and morbid fascination. And then I heard it, the sound that would haunt me far longer than Elle's slap or her cruel words. Preston was laughing. My son, the child I had raised, the man I had sacrificed everything to build into success, was actually laughing at my humiliation. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable chuckle, but genuine amusement at seeing his mother assaulted and degraded by his new wife. "Preston," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. He looked at me with eyes that I barely recognized, cold and dismissive. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom, ensuring that every guest would hear his response. "Mom, don't upset my wife," he said with a casual shrug, as if I were a misbehaving child rather than the woman who had given him life and everything he possessed. "It's her wedding day. Maybe you should go clean yourself up and let us get back to celebrating." The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not a word of defense for his mother. Not a single syllable of reproach for his wife's behavior. Just dismissal, as casual and cutting as a blade between the ribs. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, feeling the weight of 300 stares, the sting of my burning cheek, and the crushing pain of my son's betrayal. The champagne stain on my own dress, a smaller casualty of the spill, seemed insignificant compared to the stain this moment had left on my soul. But then something shifted inside me. The pain began to crystallize into something harder, sharper, more useful. I had built an empire from nothing, had survived the loss of my husband, and emerged stronger. I had faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers, had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was not some helpless victim to be humiliated and dismissed. I straightened my shoulders and looked around the ballroom, meeting the eyes of our guests with calm dignity. Some looked away in embarrassment, others stared back with expressions ranging from sympathy to anticipation. They were waiting to see how I would respond, how the woman who had built the Drake hospitality empire would handle this public degradation. I smiled. Not the warm, gracious smile I'd been wearing all evening, but something cooler, more controlled. It was the smile I wore in boardrooms when I was about to destroy a competitor, the expression that had earned me both fear and respect in business circles. "Of course," I said softly, my voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I wouldn't want to upset anyone on such a special day." I walked calmly toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence. I didn't look back at Preston or Elle, didn't acknowledge the whispers that began to follow in my wake. I simply walked away with all the dignity I could muster, leaving behind the wreckage of my relationship with my son and the last of my illusions about the woman he had chosen to marry. As I reached the doorway, I heard the band begin to play again, a forced gaiety that couldn't quite cover the tension still crackling through the air. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and I knew that this moment would be dissected and discussed for months to come in drawing rooms and country clubs across the city. But I also knew something else, something that would have surprised Elle and Preston if they had understood the woman they had just humiliated. I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. Like this video if you're ready to see what happens when someone pushes too far, and hit that notification bell, because this story is just getting started. Comment below, what would you have done in Vivian's situation? And stay tuned because what comes next will show you exactly why you should never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. The walk from the ballroom to my private study felt like a journey through a different world. The sounds of the reception faded behind me, the forced laughter, the uncertain conversations, the band playing with desperate cheer to fill the silence my departure had left. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floors of the estate's main corridor, each step measured and purposeful. The study had always been my sanctuary, a room that reflected everything I'd built from the ashes of my husband's death 25 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with first editions, business texts, and the literature that had sustained me through countless late nights of empire building. The 4th wall showcased my achievements, photographs with presidents and world leaders, awards from hospitality organizations, framed newspaper articles chronicling the rise of Drake Enterprises from a single struggling hotel to an international luxury brand. My desk, a massive mahogany piece that had belonged to my husband's grandfather, commanded the center of the room. Upon it sat the tools of modern power, multiple phones, a computer with 3 monitors, and a secure communication system that kept me connected to my business interests around the world. This was where I had orchestrated million-dollar deals, where I had outmaneuvered competitors twice my size, where I had built something lasting in a world that seemed designed to tear down everything I loved. I closed the door behind me and locked it, needing this moment of absolute privacy to process what had just happened. My reflection in the window showed the full damage, the champagne stain across my midnight blue dress, the red mark on my cheek where Elle's hand had connected, and something else, something harder in my eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. I moved to the small bar cart in the corner and poured myself 2 fingers of the Macallan 25, a whiskey that had been aging longer than Elle had been alive. The irony wasn't lost on me. I took a sip, feeling the burn ground me in the present moment, then moved to my desk and activated the secure line. Bennett Reeve answered on the first ring, despite the late hour. In 15 years of business together, he had never once failed to take my calls, a dedication that had made him both wealthy and indispensable. His voice, cultured and precise, carried the weight of absolute discretion. "Mrs. Drake," he said simply, and I could hear in those 2 words that he understood this wasn't a social call. Bennett had an uncanny ability to read the temperature of a situation from the smallest verbal cues, a skill that had served both of us well in countless delicate financial maneuvers. "Bennett," I replied, settling into my leather chair and pulling up the financial files on my computer screen. "I need you to execute a complete financial separation. Tonight." There was a pause, not of confusion but of calculation. Bennett's mind was already working through the implications, the legal requirements, the logistical challenges of what I was requesting. "May I ask the scope of the separation, Mrs. Drake?" I took another sip of whiskey, feeling its warmth spread through my chest as I began to outline the destruction of my son's financial life. Preston's personal accounts. All of them. The trust fund established for his 30th birthday. His corporate credit lines. The joint accounts he shares with his new wife. Every single asset that bears my name, my guarantee, or my investment. "That would include the penthouse apartment," Bennett said, his tone remaining professionally neutral even as we discussed financial warfare. "The mortgage is held by Drake Holdings, with Preston listed as the beneficiary, but not the legal owner."
"Correct."
"It reverts to the company immediately." I pulled up another screen, reviewing the staggering amount of money flowing through accounts that bore my son's name, but my financial backing. The cars. Leased through Drake Enterprises for tax purposes. They can be recalled within 24 hours. Do it. I felt a cold satisfaction in making each decision, in cutting each financial cord that bound my son to the empire I'd built. The corporate credit cards? "Cancelled as of this moment," Bennett replied, and I could hear the soft clicking of keys as he worked. "Mrs. Drake, if I may, this represents approximately $12 million in immediate liquidity that Mr. Preston has access to through various accounts and credit lines." $12 million. The number should have given me pause, should have made me reconsider the magnitude of what I was doing. Instead, it only strengthened my resolve. $12 million was what I'd spent on my son's education, his lifestyle, his business ventures, and his wedding. It was an investment that had yielded not loyalty, not love, not even basic respect, but humiliation and betrayal. "What about his position in the company?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd structured Drake Enterprises carefully over the years, learning from other wealthy families who'd seen their legacies torn apart by succession disputes. "You maintain controlling interest and executive authority," Bennett confirmed. "Mr. Preston's position as Vice President of Operations can be terminated at your discretion, as can his shares in the company, which revert to you under the succession clauses established when he joined the board." I pulled up Preston's corporate file, looking at the photograph from his first day as my business partner 5 years ago. He'd been so proud, so eager to prove himself worthy of the Drake name. That young man seemed like a stranger now, separated from the person who had stood by while his wife assaulted and degraded his mother by an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal. His business shares, then. Exercise the reversion clause immediately. The words came out calm and steady, but each one felt like a small death, the systematic destruction of every hope I'd had for continuity, for legacy, for a son who would carry forward everything I'd built. "That leaves his personal assets acquired with his own income from the company," Bennett noted. "Approximately $400,000 in personal savings, his watch collection, some artwork, a modest investment portfolio." $400,000. It sounded like a fortune to most people, but in the world Preston and Elle inhabited, it wouldn't last 6 months. Not with Elle's spending habits, her designer wardrobe, her Instagram lifestyle that demanded constant proof of affluence. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. "That's his to keep," I said. "I'm not a monster, Bennett. I'm just done being a fool." There was another pause, and when Bennett spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. "Mrs. Drake, the execution of these orders will be immediate and comprehensive. By tomorrow morning, Mr. Preston and his wife will find themselves in a significantly altered financial position." Good. I took another sip of whiskey, feeling the burn less now as my body warmed to the alcohol. "I want you to understand, Bennett, this isn't a negotiation or a warning shot. This is permanent. Preston made his choice tonight, and now he gets to live with the consequences." "Understood completely," Bennett replied. "I'll begin the transfers and cancellations immediately. You should expect some confusion from various parties once the changes take effect." Confusion. That was Bennett's diplomatic way of saying that my son and daughter-in-law were about to experience the financial equivalent of a natural disaster. Their credit cards would be declined at dinner tomorrow night. Their mortgage payment would bounce. Their car payments would fail. Everything they had taken for granted, every luxury they assumed would always be there, would simply vanish. "One more thing," I said, pulling up a final file on my computer. "Elle's credit cards. The ones I provided as a wedding gift, along with the supplementary accounts I established for her to purchase her trousseau and wedding expenses." "Ah, yes. The Lady Eleanor accounts. Current balance is approximately $80,000 in outstanding charges from the past month alone." Bennett's tone suggested he was not particularly surprised by Elle's spending habits. "Cancel them all. She can pay her own bills from now on." "Immediately, Mrs. Drake." As Bennett worked, I could hear the soft sounds of electronic transfers, the digital movement of money that would reshape two lives in a matter of minutes. There was something almost beautiful about it, the pure efficiency of modern banking allowing me to dismantle my son's comfortable existence from the quiet of my study while he danced at his wedding reception 30 rooms away. "The transfers are complete," Bennett announced after several minutes. "All accounts have been closed or transferred. Credit facilities have been canceled. Mr. Preston's corporate access has been revoked, and his shares have reverted to Drake Holdings. The penthouse deed is being processed for immediate transfer back to company ownership." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. In less than 20 minutes, I had erased 32 years of financial support, of building my son up to stand beside me as heir to everything I'd created. The empire would survive. I'd made sure of that through careful legal structuring, but the dream of passing it to Preston was dead, killed by his own hand. "Thank you, Bennett," I said quietly. "I know this was unusual." "Mrs. Drake," his voice was gentle but firm, "in 15 years of managing your affairs, I've never known you to make a decision lightly or without cause. If you've taken these steps, I have no doubt they were necessary." After ending the call, I sat in my study for another hour, finishing my whiskey and watching the security monitors that showed the wedding reception still in progress. Preston and Elle were dancing now, her ruined dress apparently forgotten or hidden under the dim lighting of the ballroom. They looked happy, carefree, completely unaware that their world had just shifted on its axis. My phone began to buzz around midnight, just as I was preparing to retire for the evening. Text messages at first, confused and slightly panicked notes from Preston about declined charges during their late dinner. Then voicemails, his voice growing more strained with each message as the reality of his situation began to penetrate. I listened to each one, but I didn't respond. There would be time for conversation later, after he'd had a chance to fully understand the magnitude of his new reality. Tonight, I simply turned off the phone and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in months. The last thing I remembered before drifting off was the sound of rain beginning to fall against my bedroom windows, washing clean the night air and, I hoped, the last of my illusions about the sun I'd raised. By morning, I had 66 missed calls. I woke at dawn as I always did, a habit ingrained from 30 years of business travel across time zones and early morning board meetings. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving behind a crystal-clear morning that made the estate's grounds sparkle like something from a fairy tale. From my bedroom window, I could see the remnants of the wedding reception, abandoned champagne flutes on tables, white linens fluttering in the gentle breeze, the ghost of celebration that would soon be cleaned away by my staff. My phone showed 66 missed calls, 43 text messages, and 17 voicemails. All from Preston. I set it aside without reading or listening to any of them. There would be time for that later, after I'd had my coffee and my morning routine, after I'd prepared myself mentally for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. But first, I needed to remember. I needed to trace the path that had led us to this moment, to understand how a love so pure and deep could have curdled into such devastating betrayal. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, noting the absolute silence that had replaced last night's celebration. The catering staff had worked through the night to restore order, and now the house felt almost unnaturally quiet, like a theater after the final curtain call. I prepared my coffee, a dark Colombian blend that I'd been drinking for 20 years, and settled in the breakfast nook that overlooked the garden where Preston had taken his first steps, where he'd played as a child, where I'd taught him to ride his first bicycle. 32 years ago, I had held my newborn son in my arms in this very house, counting his tiny fingers and toes while his father looked on with wonder. Charles had been so proud of his heir, already making plans for Preston's education, his future, his eventual role in the family business. We'd named him after Charles's grandfather, a steel magnate who'd built the foundation of what would eventually become our hotel empire. Those early years felt like a golden dream now. Charles had been an extraordinary husband, brilliant, loving, supportive of my ambitions even when society told him that wives should be decorations rather than partners. He'd encouraged me to take a larger role in the business, had valued my input on everything from interior design concepts to market expansion strategies. Together, we transformed a small chain of aging hotels into something approaching excellence. Preston had been the center of our universe, a beautiful child who seemed to embody the best of both his parents. He had Charles's strong features and easy charm, combined with my intensity and drive. Even as a toddler, he'd been fascinated by the hotels, would beg to come with us on property inspections, would sit quietly in board meetings as if absorbing business strategy through osmosis. When Charles died suddenly of a heart attack at 41, my world imploded. I was 34 years old, suddenly a widow with a 7-year-old son and a business that everyone expected me to sell or run into the ground. The vultures circled immediately, competitors who'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity, board members who questioned whether a woman could maintain what a man had built, family members who suggested I find a new husband to help manage the complexities of business ownership. Instead, I fought. I fought with everything I had, working 18-hour days while Preston stayed with nannies and housekeepers. I learned every aspect of the business that I'd previously left to Charles, the financial structures, the operational details, the complex web of relationships that kept a hospitality empire functioning. I made myself indispensable, then irreplaceable, then formidable. The cost was enormous. While other mothers attended school plays and soccer games, I was in meetings with investors and contractors. While other families took vacations, I was traveling to potential acquisition sites and meeting with architects. Preston grew up surrounded by luxury but raised by staff, his mother always working, always building, always reaching for the next goal that would secure his future. But I told myself it was worth it. Every sacrifice, every missed bedtime story, Every school event I couldn't attend was an investment in Preston's inheritance. I was building something that would last, something that would give him opportunities I'd never had, security that would span generations. I spoiled him, I know that now. Guilt over my absences manifested in extravagant gifts, exotic vacations, expensive cars, unlimited spending accounts. When he struggled in school, I hired the best tutors money could buy. When he got into trouble, I made it disappear with donations and discreet phone calls. When he showed interest in the business, I created positions for him that perhaps he wasn't ready to fill. By the time Preston reached his 20s, he never truly faced consequences for his actions. Money had always been there to smooth over any roughness, to open doors that might have remained closed to others. He was charming and handsome and intelligent, but he lacked the steel core that business requires, the ability to make difficult decisions and live with their consequences. I convinced myself that this was temporary, that maturity would come with experience. When I brought him into Drake Enterprises 5 years ago, I believed we would work together to expand what I'd built, that eventually he would take over as CEO and I would transition to a more advisory role. He was bright enough to understand the business, personable enough to handle clients and investors, and he carried the Drake name that had become synonymous with luxury hospitality. The first warning signs were small. Preston preferred the glamorous aspects of the business, the ribbon cuttings, the society events, the high-profile meetings with celebrity clients, while showing less interest in the grinding daily work of operations and strategy. He was more concerned with his image on social media than with occupancy rates and profit margins. He dated a succession of beautiful, ambitious women who seemed more interested in his last name than his character. When he met Eleanor Calloway 8 months ago, I should have recognized immediately what she represented. Elle was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of striking features and polished presentation that photographed beautifully. She moved through social circles with practiced ease, always perfectly dressed, always camera-ready, always surrounded by the kind of friends who valued appearance over substance. But I wanted Preston to be happy. I wanted him to find love, to build the kind of partnership his father and I had shared. When he brought Elle home for the first time, I tried to see what he saw in her, the quick wit that occasionally showed through her social media persona, the way she seemed to make him laugh, the obvious chemistry between them. Looking back, I realized I was seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. Elle's charm was surface deep, a performance perfected through years of social climbing. Her humor was often cruel, targeting anyone she perceived as beneath her social status. Her interest in Preston was clearly motivated by financial security and social elevation rather than genuine affection. The engagement had been a whirlwind affair, announced just 3 months after they met. Elle insisted on an elaborate proposal at the country club, complete with professional photographers and immediate social media posting. The wedding planning consumed the next 5 months, with Elle making increasingly extravagant demands that Preston seemed powerless to refuse. I funded it all, of course. The venue, the dress, the flowers, the catering, the photographer, the musicians, everything Elle desired to create her perfect Instagram moment. The bills were staggering, but I told myself it was a one-time expense, an investment in Preston's happiness and our family's future. Now, sitting in my breakfast nook with the morning sun streaming through windows that overlooked 30 years of memories, I could see the pattern clearly. Every indulgence, every smoothed-over consequence, every problem solved with money rather than accountability had led to this moment. I had raised a son who believed that love was transactional, that family loyalty could be discarded when it became inconvenient, that his mother's dedication was something to be taken for granted rather than treasured. The irony was almost overwhelming. In trying to give Preston everything, I had given him nothing of real value. In building an empire to secure his future, I had failed to build his character. In protecting him from every hardship, I had left him defenseless against a woman who would use his weaknesses to destroy the bond between us. Elle had recognized Preston's fundamental flaw, his desperate need for approval, his willingness to sacrifice anyone's respect in order to gain hers. She had played him like a master musician, gradually isolating him from family influences, encouraging his resentment of my success, feeding his ego while undermining his independence. And I had enabled it all. Every time I'd overlooked Elle's small cruelties, every time I'd bitten my tongue when she made dismissive comments about older generations, every time I'd chosen peace over confrontation, I had given her permission to see me as weak, as someone who could be pushed aside when she no longer needed to pretend respect. Last night's humiliation hadn't been spontaneous. It had been the culmination of months of calculation, Elle's final assertion of dominance over the woman who had dared to love Preston first. The champagne spill had provided the perfect opportunity, but the viciousness of her response revealed something that had been building for much longer. My phone buzzed again, call number 67. I glanced at the screen and saw Preston's name, but I still wasn't ready to hear his voice, to listen to whatever justifications or demands he might make. There would be time for that conversation later, after he'd fully grasped the magnitude of what had changed overnight. Instead, I finished my coffee and began to plan. The emotional reckoning with my son would come, but first I needed to ensure that the financial arrangements were as ironclad as Bennett had promised. I needed to prepare for the legal challenges that might arise, the social fallout that would inevitably follow, the complex process of extracting Preston and Elle from their privileged position without destroying everything I'd built. Most importantly, I needed to decide who I was going to be going forward. For 30 years, I had been Preston's mother first and Vivian Drake second. I had structured my life, my business decisions, my very identity around the goal of creating something lasting for my son. Now, for the first time in decades, I was simply Vivian Drake, not Preston's mother, not Charles's widow, but a woman who had built an empire through her own intelligence and determination. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The sun had climbed higher, bringing warmth to the garden where my son had played as a child. Soon, the cleaning crews would finish removing the last traces of his wedding, and the estate would return to its normal rhythms. But nothing would ever be quite the same. I had loved Preston with everything I had, and he had chosen to stand by while I was humiliated and degraded by a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her ambitions. That choice had consequences, and it was time for both of them to learn exactly what those consequences would be. My phone rang again. This time, I answered. Vivian Drake. My voice was calm, professional, the tone I used for business calls that required absolute composure. Mom. Preston's voice cracked slightly, and I could hear the desperation beneath his forced casualness. Mom. Something's wrong with the accounts. Our cards were declined at dinner last night, and this morning I can't access any of my usual. Preston. I cut him off gently, but firmly. I think we need to have a conversation, but not over the phone. Come to the office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Alone. But Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Elle is panicking, and we can't even. Tomorrow, Preston. 10 a.m. And Preston. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. When I said alone, I meant alone. I ended the call and immediately dialed another number, one I'd memorized 20 years ago when I'd first needed the services of the sharpest legal mind in the city. Margot Lane answered with her characteristic directness. Vivian. I was wondering when you'd call. You heard about last night? I shouldn't have been surprised. Margot's network of information was legendary among the city's elite, and a public humiliation at a high society wedding would have reached her within hours. Darling, the entire city heard about last night. The question is, what are we going to do about it? That was Margot. No time wasted on sympathy or outrage, just immediate focus on strategy and action. It was one of the reasons I'd trusted her with my most sensitive legal matters for 2 decades, and why she'd become something more than my attorney over the years. She was my closest friend, my trusted advisor, and occasionally my partner in ensuring that justice was served to those who deserved it. Lunch, I said simply. The usual place. 1 o'clock. I'll make the reservations.
And Vivian?
Wear something that shows you're not hiding. By 1 o'clock, I had showered, applied makeup to cover the faint bruise on my cheek, and selected an outfit that conveyed exactly the message I intended: a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of power and control, pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, and heels that added just enough height to remind everyone in the room that Vivian Drake commanded attention wherever she went. Le Bernardin had been our regular meeting place for years, a discreet restaurant where business could be conducted over exceptional food without fear of eavesdropping or unwanted social interruptions. The maitre d' seated us at our usual corner table, far enough from other diners to ensure privacy, but positioned perfectly to observe anyone who might be watching us. Margot was already waiting, and as always, she looked like she'd stepped from the pages of a fashion magazine. At 62, she maintained the sharp elegance that had served her so well in courtrooms and boardrooms. Her silver hair was cut in a precise bob that framed her face perfectly, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they assessed my appearance. "You look magnificent," she said without preamble, gesturing for me to sit. "Angry, but magnificent. That's good. Anger is useful if it's properly channeled." "I've already made the first move," I said, settling into my chair and accepting the glass of Sancerre that Margot had already ordered for me. Bennett executed a complete financial separation last night. Preston and his charming wife woke up to a very different reality this morning. Margot's eyebrows rose slightly, one of the few outward signs of surprise she ever allowed herself. Complete separation? Every account, every credit line, every asset that bore my guarantee or investment. The penthouse, the cars, his corporate position, all of it. I took a sip of wine, noting its crisp perfection. They're currently surviving on approximately $400,000 in Preston's personal savings. Ruthless, Margot said with obvious approval, but probably not legally bulletproof if they decide to challenge it. There are family courts that might view such actions as vindictive, especially given the timing. "That's why I need your expertise," I said, watching as Margot's mind began working through the legal complexities. "I want this to be permanent, Margot. I want Preston to understand that his actions have consequences that can't be undone with charm or apologies." The waiter approached to take our orders, and we paused our conversation while selecting our meals. The brief interruption gave me time to study my friend's face, to read the subtle signals that told me exactly how she viewed the situation. When we were alone again, Margot leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "Tell me exactly what happened last night. Every detail." I recounted the evening's events. The champagne spill, Elle's violent response, Preston's laughter and dismissal. Margot listened without interruption, her face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for several long moments. "In 30 years of practicing law," she said finally, "I've seen family relationships destroyed by money, by power, by jealousy and ambition. But I've rarely seen such a clear-cut case of someone choosing their own destruction." "What do you mean?" "Preston had everything, Vivian. Everything. A mother who loved him unconditionally, a business empire worth hundreds of millions, social position, education, opportunities that most people can only dream of. And he threw it all away to avoid a moment's discomfort with his new wife." Margot paused as our appetizers arrived, but continued speaking once the waiter had left. "The legal question isn't whether you had the right to withdraw your financial support. You absolutely did. The question is whether the actions you took last night will stand up to prolonged legal challenge, and whether there are additional steps we should take to protect your position going forward. What additional steps? Well, first, we need to examine Preston's employment contract with Drake Enterprises. I know you structured it carefully when he joined the company, but we should ensure that his termination was procedurally correct and that there are no grounds for a wrongful dismissal claim. I nodded, pulling out my phone to make a note. What else? The penthouse situation is more complex. While you legally own the property, Preston has been living there for 3 years under what could be construed as a tenancy arrangement. We need to follow proper eviction procedures to avoid any claims of illegal displacement. How long will that take? 60 days minimum. 90 to be completely safe. Margot saw my expression and held up a hand. I know it's not ideal, but it's better to do this correctly than to give them ammunition for a legal counterattack. Our main courses arrived: Dover sole for Margot, lamb for me, and we ate in contemplative silence for several minutes. The food was exceptional as always, but I found myself tasting very little of it. My mind was focused entirely on the chess game that my family relationships had become, the careful moves and countermoves that would determine not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term consequences. There's something else, Margot said eventually, setting down her fork and fixing me with her most serious expression. The social ramifications of this situation are going to be significant. High society loves nothing more than a spectacular family feud, and what happened last night will be the subject of gossip for months. I'm not concerned about gossip, I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Reputation mattered in business, and the hospitality industry in particular relied heavily on personal relationships and social connections. You should be, Margot said bluntly, because Elle and Preston are going to try to control the narrative. They're going to paint you as the vindictive mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's happiness, who destroyed his life out of petty jealousy. The truth of her words hit me like a physical blow. Of course they would try to spin the situation in their favor. Elle in particular had shown herself to be a master of social media manipulation, able to craft narratives that painted her in the most favorable light regardless of the underlying reality. What do you suggest? We get ahead of the story, Margot said, her eyes taking on the predatory gleam that had made her one of the most feared litigators in the city. We make sure that everyone who matters knows exactly what happened last night, and more importantly, we make sure they understand the pattern of behavior that led to your decision. You mean we destroy them socially as well as financially? I mean we tell the truth, Vivian. And sometimes the truth is more destructive than any lie. Margot reached into her briefcase and pulled out a tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I've already been in contact with Harper Vale at Metropolitan Society. She's very interested in writing a piece about changing family dynamics in wealthy families, and she specifically mentioned wanting to explore the challenges faced by successful women whose children marry, let's say, ambitious partners. Harper Vale. I knew her reputation. She wrote for the city's most influential society magazine, and her articles were read religiously by everyone who mattered in our social circle. A piece from Harper could shape public opinion more effectively than any advertising campaign. What would she need from me? An interview, background information, and access to some of the people who witnessed last night's events. Margot's smile was razor-sharp. Harper is very good at her job, Vivian. She knows how to tell a story that will resonate with her readers. I considered the implications. A public relations campaign would mean acknowledging the rift with Preston, making it a matter of public record rather than private family business. But the alternative, allowing Elle and Preston to control the narrative, was potentially far more damaging. Set it up, I said finally. But I want to review anything before it's published. Of course. Margot made another note on her tablet. There's one more thing we should discuss. Preston's meeting with you tomorrow. What about it? You need to be prepared for anything, Vivian. He's going to be desperate, possibly angry, definitely confused. Elle will have been in his ear all night, feeding him strategies and explanations and demands. You need to decide in advance what you're willing to discuss and what your boundaries are. I thought about this as I finished my lamb, considering the various ways the conversation might unfold. Preston could be contrite, angry, manipulative, or some combination of all three. Elle might try to accompany him despite my instructions, or might have coached him on what to say to achieve maximum emotional impact. I want him to understand that this isn't negotiable, I said finally. This isn't a business deal where we can find middle ground or a family dispute that can be smoothed over with time. This is the consequence of his choice, and he has to live with it. And if he threatens legal action, then we'll deal with it through legal channels. But Margot, I met her eyes directly. I won't be held hostage by threats or emotional manipulation. Not anymore. Margot nodded approvingly. Good. Because this is going to get much worse before it gets better. Elle isn't going to accept this situation quietly, and she's going to use every weapon at her disposal to try to force you back into line. What kind of weapons? Social media campaigns, probably. She'll try to paint herself as the victim of an abusive mother-in-law. She might attempt to turn other family members against you, or to rally Preston's friends to apply pressure. If she's particularly vindictive, she might even try to damage your business relationships. The thought of Elle using my own family and social connections against me was infuriating, but not surprising. She'd already shown herself capable of remarkable cruelty when she felt threatened. A financial crisis would only make her more desperate and more dangerous. We'll monitor all of her social media activity, Margot continued. If she starts making false or defamatory statements, we'll have grounds for legal action. And we'll make sure that everyone in your business and social circles understands the real situation before she has a chance to poison their perception. We finished lunch with the details of our strategy session complete. Margot would handle the legal aspects, ensuring that all of my actions were bulletproof from a procedural standpoint, setting up the eviction process for the penthouse, and preparing for any legal challenges that might arise. She would also coordinate with Harper Vale on the Society magazine piece that would control the public narrative. I would handle the personal aspects, the confrontation with Preston, the management of family relationships, and the delicate process of maintaining my business empire while extracting my son from it. As we prepared to leave, Margot reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. You know, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this course of action? Once we've implemented everything we discussed today, there may not be a path back to the relationship you had with Preston. I thought about her question for a long moment, considering the weight of what I was about to set in motion. Then I remembered the sound of Preston's laughter as his wife struck me, the casual dismissal in his voice when he told me not to upset Elle. The relationship I had with Preston died last night, I said quietly. Whatever comes next, it has to be built on truth rather than my willingness to be taken for granted. As we walked out of the restaurant together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The path forward might be difficult and painful, but at least it was honest. For the first time in years, I wasn't making decisions based on what Preston needed or wanted, but on what I required to maintain my own dignity and self-respect. The afternoon sun was bright as we parted ways on the sidewalk, Margot heading back to her office to begin the legal work and me returning to the estate to prepare for tomorrow's confrontation. Whatever Preston brought to our meeting, anger, desperation, manipulation, or genuine remorse, I would be ready. If this story is hitting you in all the right places, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Are you Team Vivian or do you think she's going too far? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell because tomorrow's confrontation between mother and son is going to be absolutely explosive. Share this with someone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself is never wrong, no matter who tries to make you feel guilty about it. I arrived at the Drake Enterprises headquarters building at 9:30 the next morning, a full 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with Preston. The extra time wasn't necessary for preparation. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., reviewing financial reports and correspondence, but I wanted to ensure that our conversation took place on my terms, in my environment, with me fully in control of every aspect of the interaction. The 50-story glass tower had been my vision, completed just 5 years earlier as a monument to everything Drake Enterprises had become. From my corner office on the 48th floor, I could see the entire city spread out below: hotels, restaurants, residential towers, the complex urban ecosystem that had made my fortune possible. The office itself reflected my personality: elegant but not ostentatious, comfortable but clearly designed for work rather than leisure. I settled behind my desk, a massive piece of Brazilian rosewood that had been custom designed to command attention without overwhelming the space. 3 computer monitors displayed real-time data from all of our properties: occupancy rates, revenue figures, customer satisfaction scores, the constant flow of information that kept a hospitality empire functioning. Everything appeared normal, efficient, profitable. The personal earthquake that had shaken my family hadn't rippled outward to affect the business that employed 3,000 people worldwide. At exactly 10 a.m., my assistant knocked and announced Preston's arrival. I had debated whether to have him shown directly in or make him wait, but decided that petty power games would undermine the seriousness of what needed to be discussed. "Send him in, please, Margaret." Preston entered my office looking like a man who hadn't slept. His usual polished appearance was noticeably diminished. His suit was expensive but rumpled, his hair not quite perfectly styled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a long, difficult night. More tellingly, his confident bearing had been replaced by something uncertain, almost tentative. "Mom," he said, closing the door behind him and approaching my desk with obvious reluctance. "Preston." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please sit down." He remained standing for a moment, probably hoping to conduct this conversation from a position of greater physical authority, but eventually took the offered seat. For several seconds, we studied each other across the expanse of my desk, the space that had once represented partnership and shared goals, now feeling like a battle line. "I don't understand what's happening," he began, his voice carrying a note of the petulance that had characterized his childhood complaints. "All of our accounts have been frozen. Our credit cards aren't working. Elle can't access any of the money you set up for her. The penthouse management called this morning saying there's some kind of issue with our lease." "There's no lease, Preston," I said calmly. "There never was. The penthouse is owned by Drake Enterprises, and you've been living there as a company benefit. That benefit has been revoked." His face flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. "A company benefit? Mom, I'm your son. I'm not some employee who—" "You are an employee," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Or rather, you were an employee. Your position as Vice President of Operations has been terminated, effective immediately." The words hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice again. "You can't be serious. This is our family business. I've worked here for 5 years. I've contributed to—" "You've contributed very little, Preston," I said, pulling up his performance files on one of my monitors and turning the screen so he could see the data. "Your division has underperformed every quarter for the past 2 years. Your personal initiatives have cost the company more than $3 million in failed projects. Your management style has resulted in a 40% turnover rate among your direct reports." He stared at the screen as if the numbers were written in a foreign language. "But those were learning experiences. You said I needed time to grow into the role. You said—" "I said many things over the years, Preston. I made many allowances. I covered for many mistakes." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face carefully. But that was when I believed we were building something together, when I thought family loyalty was a mutual commitment rather than a one-way street. This is about last night, he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. This is about the accident with Elle's dress. Mom, you're blowing this completely out of proportion. The casualness with which he dismissed what had happened, reducing Elle's assault to an accident, and my response to an overreaction, confirmed everything I'd concluded about his character. He genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what had occurred, couldn't see beyond his immediate inconvenience to grasp the deeper betrayal he'd committed. Tell me about the accident, Preston, I said quietly. Explain to me exactly what happened after I spilled champagne on Elle's dress. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing the trap, but unable to avoid it. She was upset. It was her wedding dress. It cost a fortune, and she was upset. She overreacted, maybe, but it was her wedding day, and she struck me, Preston. Your wife physically assaulted your mother in front of 300 people, and you laughed. I didn't laugh at you, he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. I was trying to defuse the situation, trying to keep things from getting worse. By telling me not to upset your wife. By treating her assault on your mother as my fault for causing inconvenience. I stood up and walked to the window, needing to put some distance between us before my composure cracked. Do you have any idea what that felt like, Preston? To be humiliated by your daughter-in-law and then dismissed by my own son. Mom, I'm sorry if you felt. Don't. I turned back to face him, and something in my expression made him close his mouth immediately. Don't apologize for how I felt. Don't minimize what happened. And don't pretend that this is something that can be fixed with a casual apology and a return to business, as usual. We stared at each other across the office, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine understanding. But then his phone buzzed with a text message, and his attention immediately shifted to the screen. Even now, in the middle of the most important conversation of his adult life, he couldn't maintain focus. And? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She's really struggling with this, Mom. She doesn't understand why you're punishing her for something that happened in the heat of the moment. She thinks maybe if she came to talk to you directly. Absolutely not. My voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Elle is not welcome in this building, in my home, or anywhere else in my presence. That woman laid hands on me in anger, and I will not subject myself to her presence again. But, Mom, if you could just listen to her side of things. Her side? I moved closer to his chair, close enough that he had to look up to meet my eyes. Preston, what do you think Elle's side of the story is? That I deliberately ruined her dress? That I somehow deserve to be struck? That my reaction is unreasonable? He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Elle had spent the night convincing him that I was the villain in this story, that her behavior was justified and my response was vindictive. The fact that he'd accepted this narrative so readily told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. Let me explain something to you, I said, returning to my desk and pulling up another file on my computer. Over the past 5 years, this company has paid you approximately $2 million in salary and bonuses. We've covered your living expenses, your car payments, your vacation costs, your entertainment budget. We've funded your lifestyle to the tune of roughly $800,000 per year. His face was growing paler as I recited the numbers, the full scope of his financial dependence becoming clear perhaps for the first time. In addition to that, I've maintained trust funds and investment accounts worth approximately $12 million with your name on them. Your wedding cost $400,000. Elle's engagement ring cost $60,000. The prenuptial agreement I insisted on, over your objections, protected all of these assets in the event of divorce. I don't understand what this has to do with. It has everything to do with everything, Preston. My composure finally cracked, years of suppressed frustration pouring out in a voice that echoed off the office walls. You have lived your entire adult life funded by my success, protected by my planning, elevated by my connections. And when push came to shove, when your wife attacked me physically and verbally, you chose her convenience over my dignity. He sat in stunned silence, probably seeing me truly angry for the first time in his memory. I'd spent so many years managing my emotions around him, smoothing over conflicts, avoiding confrontations that might damage our relationship. But there was no relationship left to protect. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice returning to its controlled calm. You have 60 days to vacate the penthouse. I'm following proper legal procedures for the eviction. Your company credit cards, expense accounts, and corporate access have been permanently revoked. Your employment with Drake Enterprises is terminated, effective immediately. You can't do this, he said, though his voice carried no real conviction. This is family, Mom. You can't just cut me off because of one argument. I can, and I have. I turned my computer screen toward him again, showing the financial transfers that had taken place the night before. These changes are final, Preston. They're not negotiable, they're not temporary, and they're not subject to revision based on apologies or promises. He stared at the screen for a long moment, and I watched as the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate. Without my financial support, he and Elle would have to survive on his personal savings and whatever income he could generate independently. Given his lack of real work experience and Elle's expensive tastes, that would be a significant challenge. What am I supposed to do? He asked, and for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely frightened rather than merely inconvenienced. You're supposed to figure out how to be an adult, I said without sympathy. You're supposed to find a job, support your wife, and live within your means like millions of other people do every day. But I don't know how to do any of that. I've never had to. Then you'll learn. The same way I learned how to run a business after your father died. The same way I learned to be a single mother while building an empire. The same way everyone learns through necessity and hard work. My phone rang, and I could see from the display that it was Bennett Reeve. I answered, keeping my eyes on Preston as I spoke. Bennett. Mrs. Drake, I'm calling to confirm that the final transfers have been completed. Mr. Preston's accounts have been closed, and the penthouse deed has been transferred back to Drake Holdings. There's also been some activity on Mrs. Eleanor's credit cards that you should be aware of. What kind of activity? Approximately $15,000 in charges since midnight. Luxury shopping, it appears. Several high-end boutiques and a jewelry store. I wasn't surprised. Elle's response to financial crisis was apparently to spend whatever money remained as quickly as possible, either from panic or from spite. Either way, it would only accelerate their downward spiral. Thank you, Bennett. Please ensure that all remaining access is terminated immediately. I ended the call and looked back at Preston, who had clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand its implications. Elle spent $15,000 last night, he asked, his voice hollow. Apparently. Which means your $400,000 in savings is now $385,000. At this rate, you'll be broke within 6 months. He put his head in his hands, finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of the hole he'd dug for himself. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him. He was still my son, and seeing him in pain activated every maternal instinct I developed over 32 years. But then I remembered the sound of his laughter as Elle struck me, and the sympathy faded. Is there anything I can do to fix this? He asked without looking up. Anything at all? I considered the question carefully, not because I was inclined to reverse my decision, but because I wanted to give him a complete and honest answer. No, Preston, I said finally. There isn't. You made a choice last night, a choice about who matters to you and who doesn't. This is the consequence of that choice. He stood up slowly, his movements those of a man much older than 32. At the door, he turned back one final time. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "But love without respect is worthless, and you made it clear last night that I don't have yours." After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Preston was driving back to the penthouse to tell Elle that their comfortable life was over. Somewhere, Elle was probably already planning her next move, her next attempt to manipulate the situation in her favor. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The decision was made, the consequences were in motion, and I was no longer responsible for managing my son's emotional reactions or his wife's demands. I had work to do, an empire to run, and a life to rebuild without the weight of their expectations and ingratitude. The intercom buzzed, and Margaret's voice announced my next appointment. I straightened my jacket, checked my makeup in my compact mirror, and prepared to return to the business of being Vivian Drake, not Preston's mother, not Elle's victim, but a woman who had built something lasting and wouldn't allow anyone to take it from her again. The next 72 hours unfolded exactly as I had expected, with a precision that was both satisfying and deeply sad. Bennett Reeve called twice daily with updates on the financial carnage, his reports delivered in the same neutral tone he might use to discuss quarterly earnings or market projections. The penthouse mortgage payment bounced this morning, he informed me on Wednesday. Mr. Preston attempted to transfer funds from his personal account, but the payment was insufficient to cover the full amount. And the cars. Both vehicles were repossessed at approximately 6 a.m. The Maserati was recovered from the parking garage beneath the penthouse, and the Range Rover was taken from outside Mrs. Eleanor's Pilates studio. There was the faintest hint of amusement in Bennett's voice. I understand there was quite a scene. I could imagine. Elle's attachment to material symbols of status was so complete that losing her luxury vehicles would feel like a personal assault on her identity. The public nature of the repossession, taken from the upscale fitness studio where all her friends worked out, would only compound the humiliation. What about the credit card charges? Mrs. Eleanor appears to be testing the limits of Mr. Preston's remaining resources. Yesterday alone, she spent $12,000 at Bergdorf Goodman, $8,000 at Cartier, and another $6,000 on what appears to be a spa day. Bennett paused. At this rate of expenditure, their liquid assets will be exhausted within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The timeline was even shorter than I'd calculated. Elle's panic spending was accelerating their financial collapse in a way that no external pressure could have achieved. She was destroying her own foundation, and apparently Preston was powerless to stop her. On Thursday morning, Margaret buzzed my office with an unusual request. "Mrs. Drake, there's a Mrs. Eleanor Drake on line 3. She says she's your daughter-in-law and that it's urgent." I stared at the blinking light on my phone for a full 30 seconds before responding. The audacity was breathtaking. After everything that had happened, Elle genuinely believed she could call me directly and somehow manipulate the situation in her favor. "Transfer the call to voicemail, Margaret. I won't be taking calls from Mrs. Eleanor Drake." Should I tell her that directly? "You can tell her that Mrs. Drake is unavailable and will not be returning her call." 20 minutes later, Margaret buzzed again. "Mrs. Eleanor Drake is in the lobby, asking to see you. Security is asking how they should handle the situation." I wasn't surprised. When the phone call failed, Elle would naturally escalate to a personal appearance, probably counting on her charm and desperation to break through my resolve. "Tell security that Mrs. Eleanor Drake is not welcome in this building and should be escorted from the premises immediately. If she refuses to leave, they should call the police." Understood. I watched from my office window as Elle emerged from the building 15 minutes later, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, apparently making phone calls, before finally disappearing into the crowd of afternoon pedestrians. That evening, Margot called with an update on our social media monitoring. She started her campaign, Margot Reported, without preamble. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, the full arsenal. The narrative she's pushing is that you're an abusive mother-in-law who couldn't accept your son's happiness and destroyed his life out of jealousy. Show me. Within minutes, Margot had sent me links to Elle's social media accounts. The posts were carefully crafted, designed to generate maximum sympathy while painting me as the villain. Photos of Elle looking beautiful but tragically sad, accompanied by captions about toxic family dynamics and learning to stand strong against manipulation. References to financial abuse and controlling behavior that were technically true but completely devoid of context. The responses were predictably divided. Elle's younger followers rallied to her defense, offering support and outrage on her behalf. But I noticed that the older commenters, the ones who actually knew our family's history, were more skeptical. Several people had posted pointed questions about Elle's own behavior, and a few had shared memories of my charitable work and business achievements. "It's not gaining the traction she hoped for," Margot observed when I called her back. "Her credibility is questionable, and people in our circles remember the wedding incident. But we should still be proactive about controlling the narrative." "What do you suggest?" "Harper Vale wants to meet with you tomorrow. She's prepared to publish her piece about family dynamics and changing generational values, with your situation as the central case study. It's time to tell your side of the story." I agreed to the interview, recognizing that silence would only allow Elle's version of events to gain momentum. If this was going to be a public relations war, I needed to fight it with the same strategic approach I brought to business competition. Friday brought news that our eviction process was proceeding smoothly. Preston and Elle had not contested the legal paperwork, probably because they couldn't afford an attorney. But it also brought an unexpected development that Bennett delivered with obvious distaste. "Mrs. Drake, I've received a call from James Morrison regarding a loan request." James Morrison, the man whose accidental bump had started this entire sequence of events. I could guess what was coming. Let me guess. Preston approached him for money. $100,000, to be precise. "Mr. Morrison wanted to check with you before responding to the request." The desperation was accelerating faster than I'd anticipated. Preston was now asking family friends for money, probably spinning some story about a temporary cash flow problem that would be resolved once his unreasonable mother came to her senses. "What did you tell him?" "That any financial assistance to Mr. Preston would be seen as interference in a private family matter, and that such assistance might impact our future business relationships with his investment firm." Bennett's diplomatic language translated simply. James Morrison's company managed several $1 million in Drake Enterprises pension funds, and he understood that helping Preston would jeopardize those lucrative management fees. Good. Please make sure that message reaches any other family friends who might receive similar requests. As the week progressed, I began to hear reports from various sources about Preston and Elle's rapidly deteriorating situation. Margaret, whose network of domestic staff throughout the city was legendary, provided regular updates delivered with the discretion of a seasoned intelligence operative. "Mrs. Eleanor was seen arguing with a concierge at Barney's yesterday," Margaret reported during our Friday morning briefing. "Apparently her credit card was declined on a $4,000 handbag, and she made quite a scene before storming out." "And Preston?" "He's been making the rounds of employment agencies, but without your recommendation letters, he's finding it difficult to secure interviews at the level he expects." One recruiter mentioned that his resume shows significant gaps in independent achievement. The picture emerging was exactly what I'd predicted. Preston had never learned to navigate the professional world without his mother's influence, and Elle had never learned to live within actual financial constraints. They were discovering together just how expensive their lifestyle had become and how quickly their remaining resources would disappear. On Saturday evening, I received an unexpected visitor. Charles Morrison, James's older brother and a longtime family friend, called to request a private meeting. Unlike James, Charles had never been involved in business dealings with Drake Enterprises. He was a retired judge with a reputation for fairness and discretion. I agreed to see him, curious about what perspective he might offer on the situation that had consumed my week. Charles arrived at 8 p.m., declining my offer of dinner but accepting a glass of the Macallan that had become my drink of choice for difficult conversations. He was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of measured speaking style that came from decades on the bench. "Vivian," he began after we'd settled in my study, "I need to tell you that what happened at Preston's wedding was completely unacceptable. Eleanor's behavior was disgraceful, and Preston's response was even worse." I appreciated his directness, but I sensed there was more to his visit than simple support. "However," he continued, "I'm also concerned about the path you've chosen in response. Financial warfare within families has a way of escalating beyond anyone's intentions." "What exactly are you suggesting, Charles?" "I'm suggesting that you might want to consider offering Preston a path back to the family, contingent on his wife seeking help for her obvious behavioral problems and making a genuine apology for her actions." I set down my glass and studied his face carefully. "Has Preston asked you to intercede on his behalf?" "Not directly. But he's clearly desperate, and desperate people make poor decisions. I'm concerned that this situation could spiral into something much worse if it continues unchecked." The irony wasn't lost on me. Charles was worried about Preston making poor decisions, as if the sequence of poor decisions hadn't begun with my son's choice to marry Elle and continued with his refusal to defend his mother when she was assaulted. "Charles, I appreciate your concern, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about money or business or family politics. This is about the fundamental question of who deserves respect and protection within a family structure." "I understand that you feel—" "No," I interrupted gently but firmly. "You don't understand. You can't understand because you've never been in the position of watching your child choose cruelty over loyalty, convenience over character." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden where Preston had played as a child, where I taught him to ride his bicycle and throw a baseball and believe in the importance of treating other people with kindness. Preston didn't just allow his wife to strike me, I continued without turning around. He participated in my humiliation by laughing at it, by treating it as my fault, by prioritizing her comfort over my dignity. That's not a mistake, Charles. That's a revelation of character. People can change, Vivian. With time and proper motivation, people can change their behavior. I agreed, turning back to face him. But they rarely change their fundamental values. And Preston's values were on full display that night. Charles finished his whiskey and set the glass aside, clearly recognizing that his diplomatic mission had failed. "I hope you'll reconsider. Families are precious things, and once they're broken, they're very difficult to repair." After he left, I sat alone in my study thinking about his words. Families were indeed precious, which was exactly why I couldn't allow mine to be held hostage by someone who had shown such contempt for its bonds. The weekend brought a new development that Bennett reported with obvious satisfaction on Monday morning. "Mrs. Eleanor appears to have had a revelation about their financial situation," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with his usual morning briefing. "She's begun selling personal items, jewelry, designer clothing, artwork from the penthouse." "How do you know this?" "Several high-end consignment shops have contacted their usual networks about authentication and provenance. The pieces are legitimate, but the desperation of the sales is quite apparent." I felt a grim satisfaction at this news. Elle's attachment to material possessions had been one of her defining characteristics, the constant need for designer labels, luxury accessories, and status symbols that photographed well for social media. Watching her systematically sell off these treasures must be devastating. "What about Preston?" He secured a position with Morrison and Associates, Charles Morrison Sons firm. It's a significant step down from his previous role, both in terms of salary and prestige, but it will provide enough income to prevent immediate destitution. I wasn't surprised that Charles had arranged something for Preston through family connections. It was exactly the kind of intervention I'd expected, and exactly the kind of help that would teach Preston nothing about the real consequences of his actions. What's the salary? Approximately $80,000 per year. After taxes, it will cover basic living expenses, but little more. In their previous life, Elle had spent more than that on a single shopping weekend. The adjustment was going to be brutal for both of them, but particularly for Elle, whose entire identity was wrapped up in public displays of affluence. Tuesday brought the most significant development yet. Margaret buzzed my office with barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Drake, I've just received a call from the concierge at Preston's building. Mrs. Eleanor left this morning with several suitcases, and she hasn't returned." The doorman overheard her on the phone with someone about alternative arrangements and reassessing the situation. My first instinct was satisfaction. Elle was abandoning Preston just as their financial situation became truly desperate. But that satisfaction was quickly replaced by something more complex. Regardless of my feelings about Elle, she was still Preston's wife, and her departure would devastate him. Has Preston been informed? I believe he's still at work. The building staff thought you should know before anyone contacted him directly. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange state of anticipation, waiting for the phone call that would inevitably come when Preston discovered that his wife had left him. The call came at 6:30 p.m., and his voice was barely recognizable. "Mom," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice.
Elle est gone.
She left a note saying she can't live like this anymore, that she needs time to think about her future. I don't know what to do. For a moment, just a moment, every maternal instinct I possessed urged me to comfort him, to offer support, to help him through this crisis. But then I remembered that this crisis was entirely of his own making, the predictable result of choices he'd made with full knowledge of their likely consequences. "I'm sorry to hear that, Preston," I said carefully. "Divorce is always difficult." She didn't say anything about divorce. She just said she needed space. I almost laughed at his naivety. Elle wasn't taking space. She was cutting her losses and abandoning a sinking ship before it dragged her down with it. She'd probably already identified her next target, some other wealthy man who could provide the lifestyle she felt entitled to. "Preston, what did you expect would happen? You chose a woman whose primary interest was your money, and now that the money is gone, so is she. That's not fair."
Elle loved me.
Elle loved your bank account, I said without sympathy. And now that it's empty, she's moved on to greener pastures. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before Preston spoke again, his voice hollow with realization. "What am I supposed to do now?" "You're supposed to learn from this experience and make better choices going forward." "But I have nothing left. No money, no job that pays enough to matter, no wife. You've taken everything away from me." The self-pity in his voice ignited a spark of anger that I'd been suppressing for days. "I didn't take anything from you, Preston. You threw it all away. You had a family that loved you, a business that needed you, a future that was secure and prosperous. And you chose to trade all of that for a woman who just proved she never valued you as anything more than a meal ticket.
So, that's it?
You're just going to let me lose everything. You've already lost everything that mattered," I said quietly. "The question now is whether you're going to spend the rest of your life blaming other people for your choices, or whether you're going to figure out how to build something real for yourself." I ended the call before he could respond, before my resolve could weaken at the sound of his pain. Because despite everything, despite his betrayal and his weakness and his complete failure to understand the magnitude of what he'd done, he was still my son. And hearing him broken and alone activated every protective instinct I developed over 32 years of motherhood. But protection wasn't what Preston needed now. He needed to learn that actions have consequences, that loyalty matters, that some mistakes can't be undone with apologies or tears. He needed to learn to be a man worthy of the name he carried. And if that meant watching him lose everything he'd taken for granted, then that was a price I was prepared to pay. The dominoes are falling faster than Elle can run from them. Hit that like button if you're here for this level of consequence delivery and comment below. Did Elle bail at exactly the moment you expected? Subscribe and ring that notification bell because Preston's about to discover what rock bottom really looks like, and we're just getting started on this journey of justice. Share this with someone who needs to see what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. Harper Vale possessed the kind of predatory intelligence that made her one of the most feared and respected journalists in our social circle. She arrived at my estate on Wednesday afternoon carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested she was about to thoroughly enjoy herself. I'd known Harper for 15 years, had watched her dissect scandals and reputations with surgical precision, but this was the first time we'd sat across from each other with me as the subject rather than a source. "Vivian," she said, settling into the wingback chair in my study with the comfort of someone who'd conducted countless interviews in similar settings. I have to say, when Margot called about this story, I was intrigued. But after doing my preliminary research, I'm fascinated. Harper was in her early 40s, with a kind of sharp-featured beauty that photographers loved and the analytical mind that made her articles required reading among the city's elite. Her questions would be penetrating, her observations ruthless, and her final piece would shape public opinion more effectively than any advertisement or public relations campaign. "What kind of preliminary research?" I asked, though I had a good idea of what she'd discovered. "Oh, the usual background work. Financial records, social media monitoring, interviews with wedding guests." Harper's smile was razor-sharp. "Did you know that 17 people have sent me video footage from your son's reception?" Apparently, everyone wanted to document the drama. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Video footage meant there was no ambiguity about what had happened, no possibility of Elle and Preston successfully rewriting history to paint themselves as victims. And what did the footage show? Exactly what my sources described. A woman being physically assaulted by her daughter-in-law while her son stood by laughing. Harper's expression grew more serious. "Vivian, I've covered society scandals for 2 decades, and I've rarely seen anything quite so clear-cut. There's no gray area here, no room for interpretation." She opened her portfolio and withdrew a tablet, swiping through what appeared to be social media screenshots and financial documents. "I've also been monitoring Eleanor's online activity since the incident. Her attempt to control the narrative has been instructive. She's positioning herself as the victim of family abuse, but the timeline doesn't support her story." "What do you mean?" "Well, for someone supposedly traumatized by your vindictive response to her behavior, she certainly didn't waste any time capitalizing on the situation. She was shopping at Bergdorf's within 12 hours of the wedding, posting Instagram stories about retail therapy, and treating herself. Not exactly the behavior of someone in emotional distress." Harper showed me several screenshots from Elle's social media accounts. Photos of expensive purchases, captions about living her best life, poses that were clearly designed to project confidence and success rather than vulnerability. She's also been reaching out to various media contacts, trying to sell her story to publications that specialize in family drama. The offers haven't been particularly generous. Apparently her credibility is questionable even among tabloid editors. I wasn't surprised by Elle's media campaign, but I was impressed by Harper's thoroughness in documenting it. Every move Elle had made since the wedding was being cataloged and analyzed, creating a comprehensive record of her true motivations and character. "Now," Harper continued, "I want to hear your side of this story. Not just the events of that night, but the context that led to your decision to cut Preston off financially. For the next 2 hours, I walked Harper through the history I'd been reliving in my own mind. Preston's privileged upbringing, my efforts to bring him into the business, my growing concerns about Elle's influence, and the pattern of behavior that had culminated in that night's betrayal. Harper listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just absorbing the narrative. Her questions, when they came, were precisely targeted. You mentioned that you'd spoiled Preston, that guilt over your work schedule led to overindulgence. Do you think that contributed to his inability to understand the seriousness of what happened? Absolutely. I protected him from consequences his entire life, solved his problems with money rather than teaching him to solve them himself. In trying to give him everything, I failed to give him character. And Eleanor's behavior toward you before the wedding. Were there warning signs that you ignored? I thought carefully about this question, remembering the small cruelties and dismissive comments that I'd rationalized away. Yes, there were signs. Subtle disrespect, comments about older generations not understanding modern relationships, a general attitude that suggested she saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a family member to embrace. Why didn't you address these concerns directly? Because I wanted Preston to be happy, and I thought family harmony was more important than establishing boundaries. I was wrong. Harper made several notes, then looked up with an expression that suggested we were approaching the heart of her story. Vivian, your financial response to Preston's betrayal has been described by some as vindictive and disproportionate. How do you respond to those characterizations? I respond by pointing out that Preston lived his entire adult life funded by my success. Every dollar in his accounts, every luxury he enjoyed, every opportunity he received was built on my work and my investment in his future. When he chose to stand by while his wife assaulted me, he broke the fundamental contract that held our relationship together. Some might argue that family relationships shouldn't be conditional on financial support. You're absolutely right, I said, leaning forward slightly. Family relationships should be based on love, respect, and mutual support. But when someone demonstrates that they have no respect for you, that they're willing to watch you be humiliated and degraded, then the relationship has already been broken. I simply made the financial reality match the emotional reality. Harper spent another hour exploring the implications of my decisions, the effect on the business, the social ramifications, the long-term consequences for my relationship with Preston. Her questions were thorough but not hostile, designed to elicit information rather than trap me into contradictions. As our interview concluded, Harper closed her portfolio and fixed me with a direct stare. One final question, Vivian. Do you have any regrets about how you've handled this situation? I considered the question carefully, thinking about the pain of the past week, the destruction of relationships I'd spent decades building, the uncertainty of what would come next. My only regret, I said finally, is that it took me 32 years to teach my son that disrespecting his mother has consequences. Harper's article appeared in Metropolitan Society the following Monday, and its impact was immediate and devastating for Elle's carefully constructed narrative. The piece, titled "The Price of Disrespect: When Family Loyalty Has Limits," was a masterclass in sophisticated character assassination. Harper had woven together the wedding footage, social media evidence, and financial timeline to create a story that was impossible to dismiss or reframe. Elle's assault on me was described in clinical detail. Preston's laughter was characterized as a shocking betrayal of filial duty, and their subsequent financial collapse was presented as the natural consequence of their own choices. But the most damaging aspect of the article was Harper's analysis of Elle's post-wedding behavior. The shopping sprees, the media outreach, the social media campaign were all documented with timestamps and screenshots, creating a portrait of someone more concerned with damage control than genuine remorse. Mrs. Eleanor Drake's response to her mother-in-law's withdrawal of financial support reveals the true nature of her priorities. Harper had written, rather than seeking to repair the relationship damage caused by her violent outburst, she immediately focused on maintaining her lifestyle through panic spending and media manipulation. The article included quotes from several wedding guests, all speaking anonymously but clearly representing the city's most influential families. Their assessments of Elle's behavior were universally negative, and their sympathy for my position was overwhelming. What we witnessed was not a moment of understandable frustration. One guest was quoted as saying, "It was a calculated assault on a woman who had shown nothing but generosity to her new daughter-in-law." The fact that Preston stood by laughing while his wife struck his mother was perhaps even more shocking than the assault itself. The social media response to Harper's article was swift and decisive. Elle's follower count began dropping rapidly as screenshots from the piece circulated across platforms. Her comment sections filled with criticism from people who'd previously supported her narrative. Several of her remaining brand sponsorships quietly distanced themselves from her account. More importantly, the article's impact extended beyond social media into the circles that actually mattered. Charity organizations where Elle had sought volunteer positions withdrew their invitations. Country clubs reconsidered her membership applications. The exclusive boutiques and restaurants that catered to our social class began treating her with the kind of cool professionalism reserved for people whose credit might not clear. Margaret provided regular updates on the social fallout throughout the week. Mrs. Eleanor was denied entry to the Spring Benefit Planning Committee, she reported on Wednesday. Apparently, the chairwoman felt her presence might be disruptive to the committee's work. And the Hamptons house rental? Cancelled. The property management company cited concerns about the tenants' financial stability and social standing. The systematic exclusion from elite social circles was probably more painful for Elle than the financial losses. Her entire identity was built around being seen, being envied, being accepted by the right people in the right places. Watching those doors close one by one would be devastating for someone whose sense of self-worth depended entirely on external validation. By Friday, I learned that Elle's departure from Preston hadn't been as temporary as she'd initially suggested. According to my sources, she'd been seen at several high-end social events with a significantly older man, a widowed real estate developer whose net worth dwarfed what Preston had ever possessed. Preston, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with the reality of his new circumstances. His job at Morrison & Associates was reportedly going poorly. He lacked the basic skills and work ethic required for genuine employment, and his colleagues were reportedly losing patience with his attitude of entitlement. "He keeps talking about this being a temporary situation," Margaret reported, "as if he expects to be restored to his previous position once you come to your senses." The delusion was almost pathetic. Preston genuinely seemed to believe that this was all an elaborate punishment that would eventually be lifted, rather than the permanent consequence of a permanent choice. He was waiting for me to relent, to forgive, to restore him to his previous position of comfort and privilege. He was going to be waiting for a very long time. On Saturday evening, I received a call from Charles Morrison with an update on Preston's employment situation. "Vivian, I'm calling as a courtesy to let you know that we're going to have to let Preston go." I wasn't surprised, but I was curious about the specific reasons. "He's simply not adapting to the work environment," Charles continued. "He seems to expect special treatment based on his family name, and he's been openly critical of his salary and responsibilities. My son tried to work with him, but it's become clear that he's not a good fit for our organization." "I appreciate you giving him the opportunity," I said, though we both knew the job had been a favor rather than a merit-based hire. "I also wanted you to know that he's been vocal about his situation. He's told several people that this is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved once you realize you've overreacted." The fact that Preston was still spreading this narrative, still refusing to accept responsibility for his choices, confirmed everything I'd concluded about his character. He wasn't learning from this experience. He was simply enduring it while waiting for someone else to fix it. Charles, I hope you understand that there will be no reconciliation. Preston made his choice, and these are the consequences. I understand, Vivian. I just wanted to ensure you were aware of his expectations. After ending the call, I sat in my study reviewing the week's events. Elle had successfully escaped the consequences of her actions by abandoning Preston and moving on to her next target. Preston was about to lose the only job he'd been able to secure. Their marriage was effectively over, their social standing destroyed, their financial future uncertain. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the inevitable conclusion of a tragedy that had been building for years. But there was one more act to come, one final scene that would complete the transformation of our family story from one of love and legacy to one of consequences and choices. And I was already planning exactly how that final act would unfold. Harper Vale just delivered the journalistic equivalent of a precision strike. If you're loving this masterclass in reputation management, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen consequences delivered this elegantly? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because Preston's about to lose his job and discover what happens when reality finally catches up with delusion. Share this with anyone who's ever been gaslighted into thinking they were overreacting to disrespect. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, 6 weeks after Elle's departure and 3 days after Preston's termination from Morrison and Associates. I was in my study reviewing architectural plans for a new resort property in Costa Rica when Margaret buzzed to announce that Preston was at the front gate, requesting permission to see me. I considered simply denying him entry. I had no obligation to provide him with additional opportunities for manipulation or self-pity. But curiosity won out over caution. I wanted to see what 6 weeks of real-world consequences had done to my son, what lessons he'd learned or failed to learn from his rapid descent from privilege to ordinary struggle. Send him to the study, I told Margaret. And please ask Mrs. Patterson to prepare tea for 2. Preston entered my study looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 6 weeks. His usual polished appearance had been replaced by something approximating respectability, but lacking the expensive touches that had once defined his image. His suit was off the rack rather than bespoke, his shoes showed signs of actual wear, and his haircut was clearly the work of a neighborhood barber rather than the exclusive stylist he'd used for years. More significantly, his confident bearing had been replaced by something uncertain, almost defeated. The man who'd laughed at his mother's humiliation 6 weeks earlier now stood before me with the posture of someone who'd learned exactly how precarious his position in the world really was. "Mom," he said quietly, accepting my gesture toward the chair across from my desk. "Preston." I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of genuine change beneath the obvious stress and fatigue. "You look tired." "I haven't been sleeping well." He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the little boy he'd once been. "I keep thinking about everything that's happened, trying to understand how it all fell apart so quickly." Mrs. Patterson appeared with a tea service, setting it on the small table between our chairs before withdrawing quietly. The ritual of pouring and serving gave us both a moment to settle into what I suspected would be a difficult conversation. "How are you managing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from my various sources. "Not well," he admitted, accepting his cup with hands that trembled slightly. "I lost the job at Morrison and Associates. Charles said I wasn't adapting to their work environment, but I think he was just looking for an excuse to get rid of me." I didn't correct his interpretation, though we both knew that Charles Morrison was not given to arbitrary employment decisions. Preston's dismissal had been earned through his own attitude and performance. "Have you found other employment?" "I've been trying, but it's—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to articulate his situation. "It's hard when you don't have references, when your resume shows that you've only worked for family." Most of the positions I'm qualified for pay a fraction of what I was making before. And Elle? Preston's face crumpled slightly at the mention of his wife. She filed for divorce last week. Her lawyer sent papers to the penthouse. Well, to the apartment I'm staying in now. She's citing irreconcilable differences and requesting no alimony, which I guess means she's found someone else to support her. I wasn't surprised by either development. Elle had always been pragmatic about her relationships, and Preston, in his current state, offered nothing that would interest her. The fact that she was requesting no alimony suggested she'd already secured a replacement provider. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Regardless of my feelings about Elle, watching Preston's marriage dissolve was still painful. "Are you?" he asked, looking up from his teacup with something that might have been anger. "Are you really sorry, Mom? Because this is exactly what you wanted, isn't it? You've destroyed everything I had, everything I worked for." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar flare of anger at his refusal to accept responsibility for his own choices. "Preston, what exactly do you think you worked for? Your position at Drake Enterprises was created for you, funded by my success, supported by my reputation. Your lifestyle was subsidized by my money. Your marriage was financed by my generosity. What, specifically, did you build that I destroyed?" "I built the life." His voice rose for the first time, carrying a note of desperation that was probably genuine. "I had a career, a wife, a future. I had plans and goals and dreams. You had illusions," I corrected gently but firmly. "You had the appearance of success without any of the substance. And when your wife needed to choose between defending your mother and protecting her own image, you chose her convenience over family loyalty." It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple. I set down my teacup and leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "She physically assaulted your mother in front of 300 people, called me vile names, and demanded that I clean up her mess on my hands and knees. And you laughed. I was trying to defuse the situation. You were choosing sides. And you chose the woman who had just humiliated the person who gave you life, who raised you, who funded every opportunity you ever received." Preston was quiet for several long moments, staring into his teacup as if it might contain answers to questions he was only beginning to understand. "I know I handled it badly," he said finally. "I know I should have defended you. But Elle was so upset about her dress, and it was our wedding day, and I thought if I could just keep everyone calm until later." "You thought you could manage the situation by sacrificing your mother's dignity to preserve your wife's ego." "I thought I could fix it later. I thought once Elle calmed down, I could explain to her that she'd overreacted, get her to apologize, make everything right again." The naivety was staggering. Preston genuinely believed that Elle's behavior had been an aberration rather than a revelation, that her assault on me was something that could be smoothed over with time and explanation rather than the fundamental character flaw it actually represented. "And did you try to get her to apologize?" Preston's silence was answer enough. "Did you ever, in the weeks that followed, ask your wife to acknowledge that she'd behaved inappropriately? Did you ever suggest that she owed me an apology for striking me?" "She was so stressed about the money situation," he said weakly. "She was panicking about the credit cards and the cars and the penthouse. I didn't think it was the right time to bring up old conflicts." "Old conflicts." I repeated his words slowly, tasting their implications. "Preston, your wife's assault on your mother became an old conflict in a matter of days?" He seemed to realize how his words sounded, because his face flushed with embarrassment. "That's not what I meant. I just meant that we had more immediate problems to deal with. More immediate than the fact that your wife had shown complete disrespect for your family? More immediate than addressing the behavior that had caused all of your other problems." Preston set down his teacup and put his head in his hands, the posture of a man who is finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his failures. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. I don't know how to make it right. You can't fix it, I said simply. Some mistakes can't be undone, Preston. Some choices have permanent consequences. But you're my mother. Doesn't that mean anything? Doesn't our history count for something? I stood and walked to the window overlooking the garden, needing a moment to control the emotions his words had triggered. Because of course our history meant something. Of course the love I'd felt for him for 32 years hadn't simply evaporated because of one night's betrayal. But love without respect was worthless, and respect without boundaries was meaningless. Our history means everything to me, I said without turning around. That's exactly why your choice to stand by while Elle degraded me was so devastating. You knew who I was, what I'd sacrificed for you, how much I loved you. And you chose to watch me be humiliated rather than risk a moment's discomfort with your wife. I was scared, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elle had been so angry about everything lately, so critical of you and our family. I was scared that if I took your side, she'd leave me. Finally, a moment of honest self-reflection. Preston hadn't chosen Elle over me out of conviction or loyalty. He'd chosen her out of fear and weakness. So, you sacrificed your mother to preserve your marriage. How did that work out for you? The cruel accuracy of the question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He'd thrown away his relationship with me to protect his relationship with Elle, and now he had neither. I made a mistake, he said quietly. A terrible, stupid mistake. But does one night really have to destroy everything? I turned back to face him, seeing not the confident young man who'd stood beside Elle at their wedding, but something smaller and more broken. It wasn't one night, Preston. It was the culmination of years of choices. Your choice to prioritize image over character, your choice to enable Elle's disrespect, your choice to take family loyalty for granted. That night simply revealed who you'd become. People can change, he said desperately. I can learn from this. I can be better. Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still the same person who chose convenience over courage. You lost your job because you expected special treatment rather than earning your position. Your wife left you because you couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. You're here now asking me to fix your problems instead of figuring out how to solve them yourself. The words were harsh, but they needed to be said. Preston was still looking for someone else to rescue him, still expecting that his problems could be solved by external intervention rather than internal change. What do you want me to do? He asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. I've lost everything. My wife, my job, my home, my money. What more can you take from me? I don't want to take anything more from you, I said, returning to my chair. I want you to understand what you threw away, and I want you to learn to build something real for yourself. But I don't know how to do that. I've never had to. Then learn. The same way millions of other people learn every day. Find a job that matches your actual skills. Live within your actual means. Build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial convenience. Preston was quiet for several minutes, and I could see him struggling with the reality of what I was telling him. His entire life had been built on the assumption that his problems could be solved by other people, that his mistakes could be buffed away by money and influence. Will you help me? He asked finally. Not financially, but could you provide references? Could you make some phone calls to help me find work? It was a reasonable request, the kind of assistance that many parents provided for their adult children. But it was also exactly the kind of intervention that had enabled Preston's fundamental weakness. No, I said quietly. You need to do this on your own.
But why?
I'm your son. Why won't you help me? Because helping you has always meant protecting you from consequences, and consequences are exactly what you need to learn from. Preston stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, as if the concept of facing difficulties without parental intervention was incomprehensible. So that's it? You're just going to watch me struggle and do nothing. I'm going to watch you learn to be an adult, I corrected. I'm going to watch you develop the strength and character that I should have insisted you develop 20 years ago. Preston sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a negotiation or a punishment with a defined end date. This was the new reality of our relationship, built on honesty rather than enabling, respect rather than entitlement. I love you, Preston, I said softly. I will always love you. But I will not continue to subsidize a lifestyle that taught you to value money over loyalty, convenience over character. He stood up slowly, moving like a man much older than his 32 years. At the door, he turned back one final time.
I'm sorry, Mum.
For all of it. For not defending you, for choosing L over family, for taking everything you gave me for granted. It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from him, the first acknowledgement of responsibility rather than circumstance. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this experience would actually teach him something valuable. I believe you are sorry, I said carefully. The question is whether you're sorry enough to change, or just sorry that your choices had consequences. After he left, I sat alone in my study for a long time, watching the rain streak down the windows and thinking about the strange alchemy of love and loss, of necessary cruelty and essential kindness. I had destroyed my son's comfortable life to save his character, had chosen his long-term growth over his immediate happiness. Whether that choice would ultimately prove wise remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was being honest with both of us about what love actually required. The gate monitor chimed softly as Preston's car disappeared into the night, carrying him back to whatever small apartment he could afford on his dwindling savings. Tomorrow he would wake up and face another day of rejection letters and declined job applications, another day of consequences for choices he was only beginning to understand. And I would wake up and continue building the empire that would outlast both of us, secure in the knowledge that I'd finally stopped confusing enabling with love, that I'd finally chosen truth over comfort. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. It was also the most necessary. Preston finally showed up, but was he really sorry, or just sorry he got caught? Hit that like button if you think Vivian made the right choice in refusing to help him, and let me know in the comments. Is this tough love, or has she gone too far? Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we're heading into the final acts of this story, and trust me, you won't want to miss how this all ends. Share this with anyone who's ever had to choose between enabling someone they love and letting them face reality. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a harsh cold that seemed to penetrate everything. By December, nearly 3 months had passed since Preston's divorce was finalized, and the reports I received about his situation grew increasingly grim. Margaret continued to provide updates through her network of connections, though I'd made it clear that I didn't want detailed information unless it was absolutely necessary. He's moved again, Margaret reported during our Monday morning briefing. The third apartment since November. Apparently, he's having difficulty making rent payments. I didn't ask for details, but the implications were clear. Preston was spiraling downward through increasingly desperate circumstances, each failed job interview and bounced rent check driving him further from the comfortable life he'd once taken for granted. The irony wasn't lost on me that winter had also brought unprecedented success to Drake Enterprises. The Costa Rica resort project was ahead of schedule and under budget. Our European properties were reporting record occupancy rates. The luxury travel market was booming, and we were perfectly positioned to capitalize on the trend toward experiential spending among affluent clients. I should have been celebrating these victories, enjoying the fruits of 30 years of strategic planning and careful execution. Instead, I found myself working later hours, accepting more business trips, filling my calendar with activities that left no room for reflection on the cost of my choices. The call came on a Wednesday evening in mid-December, just as I was reviewing contracts for a potential acquisition in the Maldives. Margaret had left for the day, and I was alone in my office when the phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Drake? This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Presbyterian Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Preston Drake. My blood went cold. What's happened? He was brought in about 2 hours ago. He's stable now, but I thought you should know that he was found unconscious in his apartment by his landlord. It appears to be an overdose, prescription medications combined with alcohol. The words hit me like a physical blow. Preston had attempted suicide, had reached such a depth of despair that death seemed preferable to continuing the struggle I'd forced him to endure. Will he be all right?
Physically, yes.
We were able to reverse the effects of the overdose, and he's responding well to treatment. But Mrs. Drake, this appears to have been a deliberate act. We're recommending psychiatric evaluation and possibly inpatient treatment. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every decision I'd made over the past 4 months. Had I pushed too hard? Had I mistaken necessary consequences for cruel punishment? Had I driven my own son to attempt suicide in my determination to teach him lessons about character and responsibility? I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. The drive to the hospital felt endless, my mind cycling through every conversation Preston and I had shared since the wedding, every choice I'd made in response to his betrayal. I'd been so certain that tough love was what he needed, so convinced that facing consequences would strengthen his character and teach him the value of genuine relationships. But what if I'd been wrong? What if the foundation of his personality was too weak to bear the weight of real-world pressure? What if my attempts to force him to grow had simply broken him instead? Presbyterian Hospital's emergency department was a maze of harsh fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smells. Dr. Chen met me at the nurse's station, a young woman with kind eyes and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. Mrs. Drake, thank you for coming so quickly. Your son is conscious and stable, but he's been asking for you. Can I see him? Of course. But I should prepare you. He's in a fragile state emotionally. The combination of medications and alcohol suggests this wasn't an impulsive act. He's been planning this for some time. She led me through a series of corridors to a small room where Preston lay connected to various monitors and 4 lines. He looked impossibly young and fragile against the white hospital bedding, more like the child I'd once rocked to sleep than the man who'd betrayed me at his wedding. His eyes were open when I entered, and when he saw me, tears began streaming down his face. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the medical interventions.
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry for everything. I pulled a chair close to his bedside and took his hand, feeling how thin and cold it had become. Preston, what were you thinking? How could you do this to yourself? I couldn't see any way forward, he said, his words coming slowly as if each one required enormous effort. I couldn't find work that would support me. I couldn't stop thinking about Elle, about everything I'd lost. I couldn't figure out how to be the person you wanted me to become. The last sentence hit me like a knife to the chest. In my determination to force Preston to develop independence and character, had I given him an impossible standard to meet? Had I set conditions for my love that were too harsh for someone as fundamentally damaged as I'd come to realize he was? Preston, I never wanted you to hurt yourself. That was never the point of any of this. But I have hurt myself, he said, meeting my eyes with a directness I hadn't seen from him in years. I've been hurting myself for months, just more slowly. I lost my job because I couldn't handle being treated like everyone else. I lost my wife because I couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted. I lost my family because I chose the wrong person over the right ones. He paused, struggling to catch his breath before continuing. And then I realized that I'd lost myself too. I didn't know who I was without your money, without the family name opening doors, without someone else solving my problems. I looked in the mirror and saw nothing. No skills, no character, no reason for anyone to value me. The honesty was devastating because it was completely accurate. Preston had finally seen himself clearly, had finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost and why he'd lost it. But instead of using that insight to begin rebuilding, he'd chosen to end the pain permanently. "You have value," I said quietly. "You're my son, and despite everything that's happened, I love you. But love isn't enough, is it?" His voice was barely audible now. "You can love someone and still not be able to help them. You can love someone and still watch them destroy everything good in their life." I couldn't argue with him, because he was right. Love hadn't been enough to prevent him from choosing Elle over family loyalty. Love hadn't been enough to teach him character or strength or independence. Love had actually been part of the problem, had enabled his weaknesses instead of addressing them. "Preston, I need you to understand something. When I cut off your financial support, I wasn't trying to punish you. I was trying to force you to develop the skills and character you need to build a real life." "I know," he said, "and you were right to do it. But, Mom, I think we both overestimated my ability to learn those lessons. I think the damage was too deep, had been building for too long." Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, knocking softly before entering. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to discuss treatment options with both of you." For the next hour, we talked about psychiatric evaluation, inpatient programs, and the long road of therapy and medication that might help Preston develop the emotional stability he'd never learned as a child. It was an overwhelming conversation about depression, anxiety, and the fundamental personality disorders that had made him vulnerable to someone like Elle in the first place. "The good news," Dr. Chen explained, "is that Preston is young enough and intelligent enough to benefit significantly from intensive treatment. But it will require a long-term commitment to therapy and probably medication. And it will require a strong support system." She looked directly at me when she said the last part, and I understood what she was asking. Preston couldn't recover in isolation, couldn't develop healthy coping mechanisms while maintaining the same relationship dynamics that had contributed to his problems. "What kind of support system?" I asked. "Family involvement in therapy, clear boundaries around enabling behaviors, consistent emotional support that doesn't include financial rescue. It's a delicate balance between helping and enabling." After Dr. Chun left, Preston and I sat in silence for several minutes. The monitors beeped softly, marking time in a room that felt suspended between his old life and whatever might come next. "I want to get better," he said finally. "I want to learn how to be the kind of person who deserves your respect, who can build relationships based on something other than what I can provide financially." "That's going to be very hard work," I said. "It's going to mean facing some painful truths about yourself and making changes that feel impossible." "I know. But, Mom, I don't want to die." When I was lying here thinking I might not wake up, all I could think about was how much I'd wasted, how many opportunities I'd thrown away because I was too lazy or scared to do the work of becoming a real person. I squeezed his hand, feeling a fragile hope that perhaps this crisis might become the foundation for genuine change. "If you're serious about getting better, I'll support you through treatment. But Preston, I need you to understand that support doesn't mean returning to the old relationship where I solve your problems and fund your mistakes." "I understand. I don't want that either. I want to earn your respect again, but I want to earn my own respect first." Over the next week, Preston was transferred to a private psychiatric facility that specialized in treating depression and anxiety disorders. I visited him twice, participating in family therapy sessions that were both exhausting and illuminating. For the first time in years, we talked honestly about our relationship, about the ways my overprotection had damaged him and the ways his entitlement had damaged our family. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped us understand that Preston's suicide attempt hadn't been caused solely by the financial crisis I'd precipitated. It had been the culmination of decades of avoidance, of never learning to cope with disappointment or failure, of building his identity entirely around external validation. The wedding incident was a catalyst, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. But the underlying problems had been developing for much longer. Preston never learned emotional regulation, never developed the internal resources necessary for genuine independence. By Christmas, Preston had been in treatment for 2 weeks and was making what the staff described as excellent progress. He was participating actively in individual and group therapy, had started taking medication for his depression, and was beginning to talk about plans for his eventual release. I spent Christmas morning alone for the first time in 32 years, an experience that was both peaceful and profoundly sad. The estate felt enormous and empty without Preston's presence, without the chaos and energy that had defined our holiday celebrations for decades. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. Preston was finally getting the help he needed, finally addressing the fundamental issues that had made him vulnerable to manipulation and unable to cope with adversity. It would be a long road, and there were no guarantees about where it would lead. But for the first time since his wedding night, I believed that my son might actually survive the consequences of his choices and emerge as someone stronger. The question that remained was whether our relationship could survive the process of his transformation, whether we could build something new and healthier from the wreckage of what we'd lost. Preston hit rock bottom in the most devastating way possible. If this chapter brought tears to your eyes, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Did Vivian's tough love go too far, or was this the wake-up call Preston desperately needed? Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we're heading into the final chapter, and you won't believe how this story of revenge, redemption, and family ends. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes the hardest thing about loving someone is knowing when to let them fall. 1 year later, I stood in the vineyard behind my estate, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The vines were heavy with fruit, promising an exceptional harvest that would produce wines worthy of the Drake name. It had been 12 months since Preston's wedding, 12 months since the night that had changed everything between us, and I was preparing to host my annual harvest celebration. The guest list for tonight's event was smaller than in previous years, more carefully curated. I'd learned something valuable about the difference between acquaintances and friends, between people who valued the Drake name and people who valued Vivian Drake. The ones who remained after the scandal, after the social media campaigns and the Society magazine articles, were the ones worth keeping. Preston had been released from the psychiatric facility in March, after 4 months of intensive treatment that had transformed him in ways I was still learning to recognize. He'd moved into a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, found work as a junior account executive at a small marketing firm, and begun the long process of rebuilding his life from the ground up. We met for lunch every other week now, careful conversations over simple meals where we slowly relearned how to be mother and son without the complicated dynamics of money and enabling that had defined our relationship for so long. Preston was different. Quieter, more thoughtful, willing to sit with discomfort rather than immediately seeking solutions from others. I've been thinking about Elle. He told me during our most recent lunch, the first time he'd mentioned his ex-wife in months. Not missing her, exactly, but trying to understand why I was so willing to choose her over everything else. What conclusions have you reached? That I was never really choosing her, he'd said, stirring his coffee with the concentration of someone still learning to process complex emotions. I was choosing the easiest path, the one that required the least courage. Elle was just the excuse I used to avoid standing up for what was right. It was the kind of insight that his therapist had been helping him develop, the ability to see patterns in his behavior rather than treating each mistake as an isolated incident. Preston was learning accountability in a way that no amount of parental lecturing could have taught him. Elle, meanwhile, had married her real estate developer in a lavish ceremony that had been covered extensively in the society pages. The photos showed her in another custom gown, surrounded by different friends, performing the same rituals of conspicuous consumption that had defined her brief marriage to Preston. She looked happy, or at least satisfied, having successfully traded up to a more reliable source of funding. I felt no anger toward Elle anymore, only a kind of distant pity for someone whose entire sense of self-worth depended on external validation and material accumulation. She'd gotten what she wanted, but I suspected she'd never truly gotten what she needed. The evening air was perfect for the harvest celebration, warm enough to be comfortable but cool enough to remind everyone that autumn was arriving. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A flowing midnight blue dress that echoed the one I'd worn to Preston's wedding, but this time paired with jewelry that had belonged to my mother, pieces that connected me to a history that extended beyond my immediate family's drama. The guests began arriving at 7, and I positioned myself near the vineyard's entrance to greet each one personally. Margot arrived first, as always, looking elegant in a deep burgundy suit that perfectly complemented the evening's wine theme. "You look magnificent," she said, kissing my cheek with genuine warmth. "And more importantly, you look peaceful." She was right. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace with my decisions and their consequences. The empire I'd built was stronger than ever. My personal relationships were based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation, and my son was finally learning to be the man I'd always hoped he could become. Bennett Reeve arrived next, accompanied by his wife, Sarah, a quiet woman who'd been my friend long before she'd married my banker. Bennett looked distinguished in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and I was struck by how comfortable he appeared in social settings despite spending most of his time managing other people's money and secrets. "Vivian," he said, taking my hand with the formal courtesy that had characterized our relationship for 15 years. "The financial reports for the quarter are exceptional. You should be very proud of what you've accomplished." Harper Vale appeared shortly after, her sharp eyes already scanning the gathering for potential stories. But tonight she was here as a friend rather than a journalist, and I appreciated her ability to separate her professional instincts from her personal relationships. "Any regrets about the article?" she asked as we stood together watching the other guests mingle among the vine rows. "None," I said honestly. "It needed to be said, and you said it perfectly." The evening unfolded with a kind of elegant rhythm that comes from careful planning and genuine hospitality. The wine was exceptional, a reserve vintage from grapes grown on these very vines, bottled during the year Preston was born. The food was prepared by the chef from our flagship hotel, each dish designed to complement the wines and showcase the best of seasonal ingredients. As the sun set completely and string lights illuminated the vineyard, I felt a presence behind me and turned to see Preston approaching. He'd arrived quietly, as had become his habit, preferring to observe before engaging. He looked good, healthy and clean, wearing a suit that was clearly off the rack but well-fitted and appropriate. "Mom," he said simply, and I was struck by how much weight that single word now carried. No expectations, no manipulation, just acknowledgement of our relationship and his place in my life. "Preston, I'm glad you came." We stood together watching the other guests, and I was aware of the subtle attention our interaction was drawing. Everyone knew our story, knew about the wedding incident and the financial consequences and Preston's subsequent breakdown and recovery. They were curious about how we'd navigated our way back to something resembling a normal mother-son relationship. "How was your week?" I asked, the kind of ordinary question that had taken on extraordinary significance given our history.
Good.
Challenging but good. I got assigned to a new client account, a family restaurant chain that's looking to expand their marketing reach. It's the kind of work where I actually have to understand the business and develop real strategies, not just rely on connections and name recognition. The satisfaction in his voice was genuine, and I felt a flush of pride at his accomplishment. He was learning to find value in work that was meaningful rather than prestigious, in achievements that were earned rather than inherited. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly, and watched his face light up with the kind of joy that money had never been able to purchase. As the evening progressed, I moved through the gathering accepting congratulations on the harvest, discussing business opportunities, and enjoying the company of people who'd proven their loyalty during the difficult months following Preston's wedding. The conversation was easy and genuine, unmarked by the social positioning and competitive undertones that had characterized so many similar events in the past. Near the end of the evening, as the guests began to gather around a small stage I'd had constructed near the center of the vineyard, I felt the familiar anticipation that came with making a toast. This had become a tradition at the harvest celebration, a moment when I could reflect on the year's achievements and share my thoughts with the people who mattered most to me. Preston appeared at my elbow as I moved toward the stage, and for a moment I was transported back to that terrible night when everything had fallen apart. But this time, his presence felt supportive rather than threatening, grounding rather than anxiety-inducing. "Are you nervous?" he asked, and I realized that he was genuinely concerned about my emotional state rather than simply making conversation. "No," I said, and was surprised to discover that it was true. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly the people I want to be with. I stepped onto the small platform and accepted the microphone from the sound technician, looking out at the assembled guests. The scene was beautiful. Elegant people gathered among ancient vines under a canopy of stars, their faces warm in the golden glow of string lights and lanterns. "Friends," I began, my voice carrying easily across the quiet vineyard, "tonight we celebrate not just this year's harvest, but the process of growth itself, the way grapevines must be pruned to produce their finest fruit, the way time and patience can transform simple ingredients into something extraordinary." I paused, finding Preston's face in the crowd. He was standing with Margot and Bennett, looking relaxed and genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. This year has taught me something valuable about the difference between nurturing and enabling, between love that protects and love that strengthens. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow the people we care about to face the consequences of their choices, to develop their own strength rather than relying on ours. Several guests nodded in understanding, and I could see recognition in faces throughout the crowd. Most of them had their own experiences with difficult family dynamics, their own struggles with the balance between support and independence. I've learned that respect is not something that can be demanded or purchased. It must be earned through consistent actions and character. I've learned that loyalty is not automatic, even within families, but must be chosen daily through small acts of consideration and large acts of courage. My eyes found Preston again, and I saw tears on his face. But they were tears of recognition rather than grief, acknowledgement of truths that had been hard-won through months of therapy and self-reflection. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to choose honesty over comfort, growth over stagnation, authentic relationships over convenient ones. I raised my glass, and the assembled guests followed suit, crystal catching the light like liquid stars. So tonight, I offer a toast to all of us who have had the courage to prune away the parts of our lives that were comfortable but unhealthy, who have chosen the difficult path of genuine growth over the easy path of maintained illusions. The guests raised their glasses higher, and I could feel the weight of shared understanding, the recognition that we'd all faced moments when easy choices and right choices had diverged. To those who have learned that love without boundaries is not love at all, but a kind of cruelty that prevents the people we care about from developing their own strength. Preston stepped forward slightly, his own glass raised, his face reflecting a mixture of pride and gratitude that took my breath away. "And finally," I said, my voice growing stronger as I reached the culmination of everything I'd learned over the past year, to the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most difficult pruning, that sometimes we must lose what we thought we wanted in order to find what we actually need. The toast was received with warm applause and the kind of appreciative murmur that indicated genuine connection with the sentiment. As the guests began to disperse, moving back toward the house for final conversations and farewells, Preston approached the stage. "Mom," he said, offering his hand to help me down from the platform, "that was beautiful. And I want you to know that I understand what you did for me, even when it felt like you were destroying my life." I accepted his assistance, noting the steadiness of his grip, the confidence in his posture that spoke of someone who'd found solid ground within himself. "You did the work, Preston. I just created the circumstances that made the work necessary." "No," he said seriously, "you loved me enough to let me fail, to let me face consequences, to let me discover who I could become when I wasn't being protected from reality. That took more courage than I think I understood at the time." We walked together toward the house, past guests who were beginning to make their departures, past vines that would soon be harvested to create something beautiful and lasting. "I have something to tell you," Preston said as we reached the terrace. "I've been accepted to graduate school, an MBA program that focuses on sustainable business practices. I want to learn how to build something meaningful, something that contributes to the world rather than just extracting profit from it." The news filled me with a pride that was entirely different from anything I'd felt during his privileged years. This was pride in choices he'd made independently, in goals he'd set for himself, in a future he was building with his own hands and mind. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it completely. "Are you excited?" "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "But yes, excited too. For the first time in my life, I'm looking forward to doing something difficult because I know I'll be proud of myself for doing it well." As the last guest departed and the staff began cleaning up the vineyard, Preston and I sat together on the terrace overlooking the scene of tonight's celebration. The string lights were still glowing, creating pools of warmth in the darkness, and the air carried the faint sound of laughter from the staff as they worked. "Do you think we'll be all right?" Preston asked quietly. "Our relationship, I mean. Do you think we can build something new that's actually healthy?" I considered his question carefully, thinking about the journey we'd both taken over the past year, the mistakes we'd made, and the lessons we'd learned. "I think we're already building it," I said finally. "Every conversation we have where we're honest with each other, every boundary we respect, every choice we make based on what's right rather than what's comfortable, that's us building something new." He nodded, and we sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. "I love you, Mom," he said eventually. "And I respect you. I don't think I understood the difference between those two things before." "I love you too," I replied. "And I'm proud of the man you're becoming." As Preston drove away that night, heading back to his modest apartment and his ordinary life, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper and more lasting than anything I'd experienced during the years when he'd lived in luxury funded by my success. He was building something real now, something that belonged to him rather than being borrowed from my achievements. The midnight blue dress I'd worn to his wedding had represented my determination to be gracious despite my reservations about Elle. The midnight blue dress I'd worn tonight represented something entirely different, my commitment to loving my son enough to let him become himself, even when that process required letting go of everything I'd thought I wanted for him. Standing alone on the terrace, as the vineyard settled into peaceful darkness, I raised one final glass to the quiet night air. To choosing love over comfort, I whispered to the stars. To choosing growth over safety. To choosing truth over convenience. The wine was perfect, complex and balanced, the product of careful cultivation and patient aging. Like the relationship I was building with my son, like the life I was creating for myself, it was something that had required both time and struggle to reach its full potential. and it was worth every difficult moment it had taken to create. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of justice, consequence, and ultimately, redemption. If this story moved you, please smash that like button and let me know in the comments what part hit you the hardest. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Your support means everything to me and helps me keep bringing you these powerful stories that speak to real experiences we all face.